The moment I saw my parents sitting across that courtroom, smug grins plastered on their faces like they'd already won the lottery, I knew this wasn't going to be just another family disagreement. This was war, and they had no idea what was coming. My name is Elena Martinez, and I'm a lieutenant in the United States Navy. For the past 8 years, I've been stationed everywhere from Norfolk to Bahrain, learning that discipline isn't just about following orders. It's about standing up when everyone else sits down. It's about speaking truth when lies feel easier. And sometimes, it's about walking into a courtroom to fight the people who raised you. 3 months earlier, I'd gotten the call that changed everything. My grandmother, Carmen Martinez, had passed away in her sleep at 82. She wasn't just my grandmother, she was my anchor, my compass, the woman who taught me that integrity wasn't negotiable, and that family meant more than blood. While my parents were busy chasing their own lives, Carmen raised me in her small house near the coast, filling my childhood with homemade empanadas and stories about resilience. But Carmen was more than a loving grandmother. She was a businesswoman who'd spent 40 years building something remarkable. 7 vacation rental properties scattered across the Florida Keys. Nothing fancy, mind you, just charming little cottages painted in soft blues and yellows, each one with a front porch swing and a view of the water. She'd bought them one by one, renovating them herself, renting them to families who needed affordable getaways and retirees looking for peace. I spent every summer of my childhood helping her maintain those properties, painting shutters in the blazing heat, fixing leaky faucets, sweeping sand off porches after storms. Carmen would hand me a paintbrush and say, "Mija, these houses aren't just buildings. They're dreams for people who work hard and deserve a break." She taught me that wealth wasn't about accumulation, it was about service. The funeral was exactly what Carmen would have wanted. Simple, honest, filled with people whose lives she'd touched. Tenants who'd rented her cottages for decades stood beside church friends and local business owners. Everyone had a story about her kindness, her fairness, her refusal to raise rents even when the market demanded it. She believed housing should be affordable, that profit shouldn't come at the expense of people's peace. After the service, I expected to sit down with my parents and discuss the properties. Carmen had always told me she wanted me to take over when she was gone. She'd said it countless times, usually while we were working together on cottage repairs. "You understand what these places mean, Elena. You care about the people who stay here, not just the money they bring in." But when I brought it up with my parents, their response caught me completely off guard. My father, Roberto, crossed his arms and delivered the news like he was announcing the weather. "We've already filed the paperwork. The properties transfer to us automatically. There's no will." "No will?" I stared at him, confused. Carmen was the most organized woman I'd ever known. She labeled everything, kept meticulous records, planned every detail of her life down to which flowers she wanted at her funeral. The idea that she'd leave her life's work without clear instructions seemed impossible. My mother, Linda, jumped in quickly. "Elena, you're always deployed somewhere. You can't manage rental properties from overseas. We're the logical choice." She said it with that tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that made disagreement seem childish. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. But grief has a way of clouding judgment, and I was still processing the loss. So I let it go, telling myself that maybe they knew something I didn't. Maybe Carmen had changed her mind in her final years. Maybe I'd misunderstood her intentions all along. The next few weeks passed in a blur of Navy responsibilities and sleepless nights. I was preparing for another deployment, trying to process Carmen's death while maintaining my duties as a logistics officer. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice telling me those properties were meant to help people, not enrich them. Then came the phone call that shattered any remaining doubt. Mrs. Rodriguez, one of Carmen's long-term tenants, was sobbing on the other end of the line. "Elena, they're kicking us out. Your parents, they want to triple our rent. We've been here 15 years and they're treating us like strangers." My blood ran cold. Carmen had always kept rents reasonable, especially for longtime tenants who'd become like family. Mrs. Rodriguez was a widow who cleaned offices at night to afford her modest cottage. Carmen would never have allowed her to be displaced for profit. I called my parents immediately. When I confronted my father about the rent increases, his response was brutal in its honesty. "Elena, this is business. Carmen was too soft. These properties can generate serious income if we manage them properly." Too soft. He called the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me everything about honor and service, too soft. That's when I knew this wasn't about inheritance or family dynamics. This was about greed, plain and simple. And I wasn't going to let it happen. I started making calls, first to Carmen's longtime attorney, who seemed genuinely surprised by my parents' claims. "Elena, your grandmother came to see me just 2 months before she passed. She was very concerned about ensuring those properties stayed affordable. She definitely intended to formalize her wishes." Then I spoke with Carmen's pastor, who mentioned that she'd seemed relieved about getting her affairs in order during their last conversation. The bank manager confirmed that Carmen had visited recently to update her safe deposit box information. Piece by piece, a picture emerged that contradicted everything my parents had told me. The more I investigated, the more suspicious their story became. They'd filed inheritance paperwork with unusual speed, claiming immediate ownership based on laws that didn't quite apply to Carmen's situation. They'd already contacted real estate agents about property values. They were moving fast, like people trying to establish facts before anyone could question them. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Carmen's neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who'd known her for 30 years, pulled me aside during a visit to her house. "Your grandmother was worried about your parents, Elena. She told me she'd made arrangements to protect those cottages from being sold. Said she'd signed papers to make sure they stayed in the right hands." Signed papers, a will. Everything my parents claimed didn't exist. That night, I sat in Carmen's kitchen, surrounded by the familiar smells of coffee and vanilla candles, and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let my parents steal Carmen's legacy. I wasn't going to let them destroy something she'd spent decades building. And I wasn't going to abandon the families who depended on those affordable cottages. I was going to court. Not for money, not for property, but for justice. For Carmen's memory, and for the principle that truth matters more than convenience. As I started gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case, I had no idea that my parents had already made their own preparations. They'd hired an attorney, crafted their story, and prepared to paint me as a greedy daughter trying to steal her family's rightful inheritance. They thought they held all the cards. They thought their lies would stand unchallenged in front of a judge who'd hear just another family dispute over money. They had no idea what was coming. The first person I called was Maria Santos, Carmen's cleaning lady for over 20 years. When she answered the phone, I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. She'd been working 3 jobs since my parents doubled her cleaning rate and cut her hours in half. "Elena, your abuela loved you so much," Maria whispered, like she was afraid someone might overhear. "She talked about you all the time, said you were the only one who understood what those casitas meant to people like us." I gripped the phone tighter. "Maria, did my grandmother ever mention a will? Any legal documents?" The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Maria's voice came back, barely audible. "Mija, there are things I probably shouldn't say. But your grandmother, she was scared those last few months. Scared of what would happen to the cottages if something happened to her." "Scared of what, specifically?" "Of your parents, Elena. She knew they saw dollar signs where she saw homes." That conversation lit a fire in my chest that Navy training had taught me to channel into action. I drove straight to Carmen's house, keys still heavy in my pocket, and began searching every drawer, every file cabinet, every shoebox in her closets. If Carmen had prepared legal documents, they had to be somewhere. The house felt hollow without her presence, but her organization system remained intact. bills filed by month, tenant information sorted alphabetically, maintenance records dating back 15 years. Carmen had documented everything except, apparently, her final wishes. But then I found something interesting, a receipt from a notary public, dated just 6 weeks before Carmen's death. The receipt showed a fee for document notarization and witness services, but no details about what had been notarized. I photographed it with my phone and kept digging. In Carmen's bedroom, tucked inside her jewelry box beneath a tangle of rosary beads, I found a business card for Patricia Hernandez, attorney at law. The card was creased like it had been handled repeatedly, and there was a handwritten note on the back in Carmen's careful script. Tuesday, 10 p.m., final copy. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. A receptionist answered on the second ring. Ms. Hernandez's office. How can I help you? This is Elena Martinez. I'm calling about my grandmother, Carmen Martinez. She may have been a client recently. Hold, please. The hold music felt like it lasted forever. When Patricia Hernandez finally came on the line, her voice was warm but cautious. Elena, yes, your grandmother spoke about you often. I'm so sorry for your loss. Ms. Hernandez, I need to ask you directly, did my grandmother prepare a will with your office? Another pause. This one felt different, weighted with professional consideration. Elena, I need to be careful about attorney-client privilege, even after a client's death. But I can tell you this, your grandmother was very concerned about ensuring her wishes were legally documented and properly executed. Were they documented and executed? That's complicated. Can you come to my office? This conversation needs to happen in person. I was in my car within 10 minutes, driving through downtown Key Largo with my heart hammering against my ribs. Patricia's office was in a small strip mall between a Cuban restaurant and a hardware store, exactly the kind of unpretentious place Carmen would have chosen. Patricia Hernandez was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and eyes that had clearly seen their share of family disputes. She gestured for me to sit in a worn leather chair across from her desk, which was covered in neat stacks of legal documents. Your grandmother came to me 8 weeks before her death, Patricia began carefully. She was very specific about her intentions regarding the 7 rental properties. She wanted them managed by someone who would maintain their affordability and character. She wanted me to manage them. Patricia nodded. You specifically. She was adamant about that. Said you were the only family member who understood that those properties were about service, not profit. I leaned forward in my chair. So there is a will. There was a will. We completed it, had it properly witnessed and notarized. Your grandmother left here with a fully executed document that would have made you the sole beneficiary of the properties, with specific instructions about maintaining affordable rents. Was. Past tense. My stomach dropped. What happened to it? Patricia's expression darkened. That's what I'd like to know. 3 days after your grandmother's funeral, your parents came here demanding to see any documents we had prepared. When I explained that I couldn't discuss client matters without proper authorization, they became aggressive. Aggressive how? Your father threatened to report me to the state bar for hiding assets. Your mother accused me of manipulating an elderly woman. They seemed to know that a will existed, but they also seemed confident it wouldn't surface. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that made my chest tight with anger. They knew about the will. They knew Carmen had made legal arrangements, and they did something to prevent those arrangements from being honored. Patricia opened a file drawer and pulled out a thin folder. I kept copies of our preliminary discussions and notes from our meetings. I can't give you the actual will because I don't have it. Your grandmother took the original with her, as is standard practice. And that original is now missing. It would appear so. Which brings us to a very serious legal issue, Elena. If a will exists but has been destroyed or hidden to prevent its execution, that's considered fraud. In some cases, criminal fraud. The word hung in the air between us like smoke. Fraud. My parents hadn't just inherited property through some legal oversight. They had potentially committed a crime to steal Carmen's legacy. Patricia continued, her voice gentle but firm. I've been practicing estate law for 25 years. I've seen families tear themselves apart over far less than 7 valuable properties. But what your parents appear to have done goes beyond typical inheritance disputes. What are my options? You can contest their claim in probate court. With my testimony about the will's existence and your grandmother's clear intentions, plus any other evidence you can gather, you might be able to prove that a valid will existed and was improperly suppressed. Might. The uncertainty in that word felt like standing on unstable ground, but it was better than accepting defeat. I need to think about this, I said, standing to leave. Patricia handed me her card. Elena, I need you to understand something. This won't be a simple legal proceeding. Your parents have already established their claim. They'll fight hard to protect it. And family litigation is particularly brutal because it's personal. I slipped her card into my wallet next to Carmen's photograph. Ms. Hernandez, I've been deployed to places where people fight over water and sand. I think I can handle a fight over what's right. She smiled for the first time during our conversation. Your grandmother said you had steel in your spine. I think she was right. Driving back to Carmen's house, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced since receiving news of her death. This wasn't just about property or money. This was about honoring the woman who'd shaped my understanding of integrity and service. This was about protecting families like Mrs. Rodriguez from being displaced by greed. But mostly this was about proving that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight costs everything you thought you knew about family. That night, I sat at Carmen's kitchen table and started making lists. Evidence to gather, people to interview, questions to ask. The Navy had taught me that successful operations require thorough planning and attention to detail. This operation would be no different. I was going to find that will. I was going to expose the truth about what my parents had done. And I was going to make sure Carmen's legacy survived their attempt to bury it. They wanted a war. They were about to get one from someone trained to win. The first witness I needed to find was Carmen's notary. According to the receipt I'd discovered, someone had notarized documents for her just weeks before her death. If I could prove those documents were a will, and if I could show that will had mysteriously vanished after Carmen's passing, I'd have the foundation of a case. Finding the notary turned out to be easier than expected. The receipt led me to a small office above a pharmacy in Key Largo, where an elderly Cuban man named Eduardo Morales had been providing notary services for 30 years. His office smelled like coffee and old paper, walls lined with certificates and family photos. Eduardo remembered Carmen immediately. Señora Martinez. See, she was very nervous that day, kept asking if the papers would be legal, if they would hold up if someone challenged them. My pulse quickened. Do you remember what kind of papers? He nodded slowly. A will. Very detailed will. She had 2 witnesses with her, very proper. She signed everything. I stamped it with my seal. She seemed relieved when we finished, like a weight had been lifted. Who were the witnesses? Eduardo pulled out a worn ledger book, flipping through pages until he found the entry. Here, Mrs. Sophia Reyes and Mr. James Mitchell, both signed as witnesses to her signature. I photographed the ledger page, my hands trembling slightly. This was proof. Documented, dated, witnessed proof that Carmen had executed a legal will just weeks before her death. Sophia Reyes lived in a tidy duplex 3 blocks from Carmen's house. She was a retired teacher who'd known Carmen through their church, and when I explained why I was there, her face hardened with understanding. I wondered what happened to that will, she said, inviting me into her living room. Carmen was so particular about everything being done correctly. She made Eduardo explain every step twice. Do you remember what the will said? Sophia settled into her recliner, choosing her words carefully. She wanted you to have the properties, mija, all 7 of them. She was very clear about that. She said you were the only one who understood that those cottages were meant to help people, not make someone rich. Did she mention my parents at all? Sophia's expression darkened. She was worried about them. Said they'd been asking too many questions about her finances, about what would happen to the properties when she was gone. She seemed afraid they might try to interfere. James Mitchell, the second witness, was harder to track down. He was a part-time handyman who'd done work for Carmen over the years. I finally found him at a marina where he worked on boat repairs, his hands stained with oil and salt water. Carmen was good people, he said when I explained my visit. Treated everyone fair, never tried to squeeze extra money out of folks. That's why what she told me stuck in my head. What did she tell you? James wiped his hands on a rag, looking out over the water. After we signed those papers, she pulled me aside, said she was worried her family might cause trouble after she was gone, asked me to remember that day, remember what she'd signed, in case anyone ever claimed she hadn't made proper arrangements. She knew my parents might try to suppress the will. She was smart, your grandmother, saw people for what they were, not what they pretended to be. By the time I'd interviewed both witnesses, I had a clear picture of what had happened. Carmen had prepared a comprehensive will, properly witnessed and notarized, leaving her properties to me with specific instructions about maintaining their affordability. She'd been worried enough about my parents' intentions to specifically ask a witness to remember the signing, and now that will had conveniently disappeared. But gathering evidence was only half the battle. I needed legal representation, someone who could navigate the complexities of probate court, and wasn't afraid to take on a contentious family dispute. Patricia Hernandez recommended Michael Chen, a probate attorney with a reputation for thorough preparation and courtroom tenacity. When I met him at his office the following week, he listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "This is a strong case," he said when I finished. "But you need to understand what you're up against. Your parents have already filed their inheritance claim. They're in possession of the properties. They'll argue that no will existed, that you're a disgruntled family member trying to overturn a legitimate inheritance. But I have witnesses. I have the notary's records, which proves a will was created, not that it was valid or what it contained. Your parents' attorney will argue that your grandmother might have changed her mind, might have destroyed the will herself, might have prepared multiple wills with different provisions." The legal complexities were daunting, but Michael's confidence was reassuring. "Here's what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to file a petition to contest their inheritance claim. We're going to depose everyone involved, including your parents, and we're going to force them to explain under oath what happened to a will that multiple witnesses confirm existed." Filing the petition felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Once those papers were submitted to the court, there would be no pretending this was just a family misunderstanding. This would be public, official, documented. My parents would know I was serious about fighting them. The petition was filed on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, my phone was ringing. My father's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Elena, what the hell do you think you're doing? I'm protecting Carmen's wishes. You're destroying this family over money." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "This isn't about money, Dad. This is about honesty. Carmen made a will, and you know it." "There was no will. If there had been, we would have found it." "You would have found it because you were looking for it. The question is what you did when you found it." The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to voice directly. "Elena," my father said finally, his voice softer but no less determined, "drop this lawsuit. You're embarrassing yourself and hurting people who love you. People who love me wouldn't steal from the woman who raised me." He hung up without another word. My mother tried a different approach, calling the next morning with tears in her voice. "Elena, sweetheart, you're breaking my heart. Carmen loved all of us. She wouldn't want us fighting like this." "Then why didn't you tell me about the will, Mom?" "Because there wasn't one, honey. I know you want to believe she made special arrangements for you, but sometimes people don't plan as well as we hope they do. The lie came so easily, delivered with such practiced sincerity, that for a moment I almost doubted what I knew to be true. But then I thought about Eduardo's ledger, Sophia's clear memory, James's concern about Carmen's family causing trouble. Mom, I have witnesses who saw her sign it. My mother's voice hardened. Witnesses can be mistaken. Old people sometimes think they remember things that didn't happen. Multiple witnesses, a notary's official record. Elena, please, don't do this to us. Don't do this to yourself. But I was already doing it. The legal process had begun, and there was no stopping it now. The first court hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, a preliminary proceeding where both sides would present their basic arguments. Michael warned me that this initial hearing was mostly procedural, but it would give us our first look at my parents' legal strategy. Those 6 weeks passed in a blur of depositions, document requests, and sleepless nights. I interviewed every tenant Carmen had worked with, every contractor who'd maintained the properties, every neighbor who might have witnessed her concerns about my parents. The picture that emerged was consistent and damning. Carmen had been worried about her family's interest in the properties. She'd taken steps to protect her legacy. She'd made legal arrangements that somehow vanished after her death. But the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Rodriguez, the longtime tenant my parents were trying to evict, mentioned something during our conversation that made my blood run cold. "The day after the funeral," she said, "I saw your father at your grandmother's house very early in the morning. He was carrying a box to his car, looking around like he didn't want to be seen. I thought it was strange because the funeral had been so hard on him, but there he was, cleaning out the house before anyone else was awake." A box, removed secretly, early in the morning, the day after Carmen's funeral. I called Michael immediately. "Elena, that's circumstantial evidence, but it's powerful. Combined with everything else, it paints a picture of deliberate concealment." "It's enough for court?" "It's enough to make your parents very uncomfortable when they're questioned under oath." The morning of the hearing arrived gray and humid, typical Florida weather that seemed to match my mood. I wore my dress blue uniform, not to intimidate, but because it reminded me who I was and what I stood for. Honor, integrity, service before self. The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected, a modest building that had probably seen decades of family disputes just like this one. Michael met me at the entrance, carrying a briefcase full of evidence and wearing the confident expression of an attorney who believed in his case. "Remember," he said as we walked through the metal detector, "let me do the talking. Answer questions directly and honestly, but don't volunteer information. Your parents' attorney will try to make you seem greedy or vindictive." My parents were already seated when we entered the courtroom, flanked by their attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate law firm. My father sat ramrod straight, jaw set in stubborn determination. My mother kept glancing at me with sad eyes, like I was a daughter who'd lost her way. They had no idea what was coming. The judge entered, an older Hispanic woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd presided over countless family tragedies. She reviewed the case file briefly, then looked up at both legal teams. "This appears to be a dispute over the estate of Carmen Martinez, specifically regarding 7 rental properties in the Florida Keys. The respondents claim inheritance by law, while the petitioner alleges the existence of a suppressed will." My parents' attorney stood first. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of intestate succession. Mrs. Martinez died without a will, and the properties rightfully transfer to her children. The petitioner is attempting to overturn a legitimate inheritance based on speculation and hearsay." When Michael stood to respond, I felt the weight of everything Carmen had built, everything she'd believed in resting on his words. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate that Carmen Martinez did execute a valid will, properly witnessed and notarized, and that this will was deliberately concealed or destroyed to prevent its execution. We have documentary evidence, witness testimony, and a clear pattern of suspicious behavior by the respondents." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Very well, let's proceed with testimony." What happened next would determine not just the fate of Carmen's properties, but whether truth could triumph over carefully constructed lies. As Michael called his first witness, I felt Carmen's presence in that courtroom, watching as the legacy she'd tried so hard to protect finally got its day in court. The battle was just beginning. The first witness Michael called was Eduardo Morales, the notary. As the elderly Cuban man walked to the witness stand, his steps careful but determined, I watched my parents' faces carefully. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My mother's hands clasped together in her lap, knuckles white beneath her thin skin. Eduardo raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the witness chair with the dignity of a man who'd spent decades handling other people's most important documents. Michael approached him with respectful deference. "Mr. Morales, how long have you been a licensed notary in the state of Florida?" 32 years, Eduardo replied, his accent soft but his words clear. "During that time, approximately how many documents would you estimate you've notarized?" "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. I keep careful records." Michael nodded, walking to his table to retrieve a document. "I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit A. Do you recognize this?" Eduardo adjusted his reading glasses, studied the paper for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, this is a page from my notary journal. Entry from October 15th, 6 weeks before Mrs. Martinez passed away." "What does that entry document?" "The notarization of a last will and testament for Carmen Elena Martinez. She came to my office with 2 witnesses. Very proper procedure. We completed everything according to Florida law." I glanced at my parents. My father was staring straight ahead, expression carved from stone. My mother kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but I noticed she wasn't actually crying. "Mr. Morales, in your professional opinion, was this will properly executed?" "Absolutely. Mrs. Martinez was of sound mind, clearly understood what she was signing. The witnesses were present throughout. I verified their identification, watched them sign, applied my official seal. Everything was done correctly." Michael paused, letting that testimony sink in. "Did Mrs. Martinez seem nervous or uncertain about the contents of this will?" Eduardo shook his head. "No, she seemed relieved. Like she'd been worried about something and finally taken care of it. She told me she wanted to make sure her wishes were crystal clear, that there would be no confusion after she was gone." My parents' attorney, Ms. Davidson, stood for cross-examination. She was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-40s, with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd made a career out of picking apart witnesses. "Mr. Morales, you testified that you've notarized thousands of documents over 3 decades. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And yet you claim to remember specific details about one particular client from several months ago. Isn't that convenient?" Eduardo's expression didn't change. "I remember Mrs. Martinez because she was unusual. Most people come in nervous about signing important papers. She came in determined, like she was protecting something precious." "But you don't actually know what was in that will, do you?" "No, I don't read the documents I notarize unless someone asks me to witness specific content." "So for all you know, Mrs. Martinez could have left everything to her children, exactly as the current inheritance claim states," Michael objected. "Speculation." "Sustained," the judge said calmly. Ms. Davidson continued. "Mr. Morales, isn't it true that elderly people sometimes change their minds about important decisions, sometimes multiple times?" "I suppose that's possible." "And isn't it possible that Mrs. Martinez might have destroyed this will herself if she decided to change her wishes?" Eduardo considered this carefully. "It's possible, but unlikely. She was very concerned about making sure her documents were safe. She asked me twice about the best way to store important papers." But you have no knowledge of what happened to this alleged will after Mrs. Martinez left your office? No, I don't. Ms. Davidson smiled like she'd scored a point. No further questions. But Eduardo wasn't finished. As Ms. Davidson turned away, he leaned forward slightly and added, "But I will say this. In 32 years of notarizing documents, I've learned to read people. Mrs. Martinez wasn't the kind of woman who changed her mind about protecting what mattered to her." The judge allowed it, and I saw Ms. Davidson's confident expression flicker for just a moment. Next, Michael called Sophia Reyes to the stand. Carmen's friend walked to the witness chair with the measured pace of a retired teacher who'd spent decades commanding respect from teenagers. She wore a simple navy dress and carried herself with quiet authority. "Mrs. Reyes, how long did you know Carmen Martinez?" 15 years. We met at St. Mary's Catholic Church, became close friends. She was like a sister to me. Were you present at Mr. Morales' office on October 15th when Mrs. Martinez signed her will? Yes, she asked me to be a witness. Said it was important to her that people she trusted were there. Did Mrs. Martinez discuss the contents of this will with you? Sophia nodded firmly. She told me she was leaving the rental properties to her granddaughter Elena. She said Elena was the only family member who understood that those cottages were meant to help people, not make someone rich. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Hearing Carmen's words spoken aloud in that courtroom made her feel present somehow, like she was finally getting to tell her side of the story. Did she mention her concerns about other family members? Ms. Davidson objected. Hearsay. Your Honor, Michael responded, this goes to the declarant's state of mind and intent, which is relevant to the validity and content of the alleged will. I'll allow it, but be careful, counselor. Sophia looked directly at my parents as she answered. Carmen was worried. She said her son and daughter-in-law had been asking too many questions about money, about what would happen to the properties. She was afraid they might try to sell everything if they got control. Did she seem mentally competent to you on the day she signed the will? Completely. Sharp as ever. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. Ms. Davidson's cross-examination was more aggressive this time. Mrs. Reyes, you consider yourself a close friend of the deceased, correct? I was her friend, yes. And you have strong feelings about how her estate should be handled? I have strong feelings about honoring her wishes. But you're not a legal expert, are you? You don't actually know whether the document you witnessed was Mrs. Martinez's final will, do you? Sophia straightened in her chair. I know Carmen Martinez. I know she didn't make decisions lightly, and I know she didn't change her mind about things that mattered. But people do change their minds, don't they? Especially about family relationships? Carmen's feelings about her granddaughter never changed. Elena was the light of her life. Ms. Davidson pressed harder. Mrs. Reyes, isn't it true that you disapproved of how Mr. and Mrs. Martinez handled their relationship with their mother? Sophia's eyes flashed. I disapproved of how they ignored her until they wanted something. Objection, Ms. Davidson called. Non-responsive. But the damage was done. Sophia's answer hung in the air, painting a picture of my parents that everyone in the courtroom could understand. James Mitchell took the stand next, still wearing his work clothes because he'd come straight from a job site. His testimony was brief, but powerful. Carmen asked me to remember that day, he said simply. She was worried her family might cause trouble. Said she wanted someone to remember what she'd signed, in case anyone tried to say she hadn't made proper arrangements. Did that strike you as unusual? Michael asked. James shrugged. I've worked for a lot of families over the years. You learn to spot the ones where money brings out the worst in people. Carmen saw it coming. When Ms. Davidson cross-examined James, she focused on attacking his memory and credibility. But his answers were straightforward and unshakable. He knew what he'd witnessed, and he wasn't going to be intimidated into changing his story. Then came the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Michael called my name. The petitioner calls Elena Martinez to the stand. Walking to that witness chair felt like the longest journey of my life. Every eye in the courtroom was on me, but I kept my gaze straight ahead, focused on the job I'd trained for my entire adult life: speaking truth under pressure. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth, and settled into the chair. Michael's first questions were easy, establishing my relationship with Carmen, my military service, my understanding of her values and intentions. Lieutenant Martinez, based on your conversations with your grandmother over the years, what was her primary concern regarding the rental properties? She wanted them to remain affordable for families who needed vacation rentals but couldn't afford luxury prices. She believed housing, even vacation housing, should serve people, not just generate profit. Did she ever discuss her plans for the properties after her death? Many times. She always said she wanted me to take over managing them because I understood her philosophy about keeping them affordable. Michael walked me through the timeline of events after Carmen's death, my parents' claims about there being no will, my discovery of evidence suggesting otherwise. My answers were precise, factual, delivered with the calm confidence the Navy had trained into me. Then Ms. Davidson stood for cross-examination, and I braced myself for the attack I knew was coming. Lieutenant Martinez, you've been deployed overseas extensively during the past several years, haven't you? Yes. So you weren't present for much of your grandmother's final years? I visited whenever I was on leave. But you weren't here day to day, caring for an elderly woman, managing her affairs, dealing with the practical realities of her declining health? I kept my voice steady. No, but I maintained regular contact with her, and she never indicated her wishes had changed. Isn't it possible that your grandmother's feelings about the properties evolved as she aged? That she might have reconsidered burdening a young woman with such significant responsibilities? Carmen didn't see service as a burden. She saw it as an honor. Ms. Davidson smiled coldly. Lieutenant, isn't it true that you stand to inherit 7 valuable properties worth potentially millions of dollars if your claims are upheld? The properties are valuable, yes. But this isn't about money. Really? You're telling this court that you have no financial interest in the outcome of this case? I looked directly at her, then at my parents, then at the judge. My interest is in honoring the woman who raised me and protecting the legacy she spent 40 years building. If that happens to involve valuable real estate, that's secondary. But you can't deny that you would benefit financially from a favorable ruling? I can't deny it, but I can put it in perspective. I'm a Navy officer with a steady income and modest expenses. I don't need my grandmother's properties to support myself. But the families who rent those cottages need them to remain affordable. Ms. Davidson tried several more angles, attempting to paint me as greedy or vindictive, but my answers remained consistent. I wasn't there for money. I was there for justice. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt drained but confident. The truth was now on the record, spoken under oath, preserved for history. But the real fireworks were about to begin. Because next, Michael was going to call my parents to testify, and they had no idea what questions were coming their way. The judge called a brief recess before the respondents presented their case. I stepped outside into the humid Florida air, loosening my uniform collar slightly, and taking deep breaths to steady my nerves. Michael joined me on the courthouse steps, reviewing his notes one final time. "How do you think it's going?" I asked. "Better than I hoped. Your witnesses were credible, your testimony was strong. But now comes the real test. Your parents have to explain under oath what happened to a will that multiple people confirm existed." Through the courthouse windows, I could see my parents huddled with Ms. Davidson, their conversation intense and urgent. My father kept shaking his head while my mother gestured emphatically. Whatever strategy they'd planned was clearly being adjusted. When we reconvened, Ms. Davidson called my father to the stand first. He walked to the witness chair with military bearing, shoulders square, chin lifted. Even now, facing questions about his potential crimes, he carried himself like a man who'd never doubted his own righteousness. Ms. Davidson began with softball questions designed to make him appear sympathetic. His years of caring for Carmen, his grief at her loss, his surprise and hurt at being accused of wrongdoing by his own daughter. Mr. Martinez, did your mother ever execute a will to your knowledge? No. If she had, we would have found it when we went through her papers after the funeral. Did you search thoroughly through her belongings? Of course. We looked everywhere. File cabinets, desk drawers, safe deposit box. There was no will. Have you ever seen the document that these witnesses claim to have witnessed? No, because it doesn't exist. Or if it did exist at some point, my mother must have destroyed it herself. Ms. Davidson nodded sympathetically. Is it possible your mother changed her mind about her estate plans as she aged? Very possible. She was getting forgetful toward the end, sometimes confused about financial matters. She might have signed something and then thought better of it later. I felt my hands clench into fists. Carmen had been sharp as a blade right up until her death, and my father knew it, but he was willing to slander her memory to protect his lie. Then Michael stood for cross-examination, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Martinez, you testified that you searched thoroughly through your mother's belongings. When did this search take place? The day after the funeral. We wanted to get her affairs in order quickly. You went to her house the day after her funeral? Wasn't the family still grieving? My father shifted uncomfortably. Grief doesn't stop practical responsibilities. Was anyone else present during this search? Just my wife and myself. No other family members, no attorney, no witnesses to what you found or didn't find? We didn't think we needed witnesses to go through my own mother's belongings. Michael paused, consulting his notes. Mr. Martinez, one of your mother's neighbors testified that she saw you removing a box from the house very early that morning. Do you recall what was in that box? My father's jaw tightened. Old papers, bills, correspondence, things that needed to be disposed of. Did you review the contents of those papers before disposing of them? Some of them. Did you find any legal documents among those papers? A long pause. Nothing important. Mr. Martinez, I'm going to ask you again, under oath. Did you find any legal documents among your mother's papers that might have related to her estate planning? My father stared at Michael for several seconds, the silence stretching until it became uncomfortable. Finally, he answered, I may have found some draft documents, preliminary discussions with attorneys. Nothing final or legally binding. What happened to those draft documents? I disposed of them. They were incomplete, not relevant to settling the estate. You disposed of legal documents without consulting an attorney or informing other family members? They weren't legal documents. They were drafts. Michael walked closer to the witness stand. Mr. Martinez, how do you explain the fact that 3 witnesses, including a licensed notary, have testified under oath that they witnessed your mother sign a completed, properly executed will just weeks before her death? People make mistakes. Memories fade. Maybe they witnessed her signing something else. Are you suggesting that a licensed notary with 32 years of experience doesn't know the difference between a will and other legal documents? Ms. Davidson objected. Argumentative. Sustained. But Michael wasn't finished. Mr. Martinez, in your experience, was your mother the type of person who left important matters unfinished? She was getting older. People change. But when she was competent and healthy, was she organized and thorough in her affairs? My father couldn't deny that. Yes. So it would be out of character for her to die without proper estate planning, especially regarding properties worth millions of dollars? I suppose. Yet you're asking this court to believe that's exactly what happened? My father's composure was cracking. I'm telling the court what I know. There was no will in her papers when we searched them. Michael returned to his table, picked up a document. Mr. Martinez, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit D. This is a receipt from a document shredding service dated 3 days after your mother's funeral. Do you recognize this receipt? My father went pale. I may have had some old papers shredded. According to this receipt, you had 3 boxes of documents professionally destroyed. Can you explain what was in those boxes? Old financial records, outdated tax returns, nothing relevant. Nothing relevant or nothing convenient? Ms. Davidson objected again, but the damage was done. My father was clearly hiding something, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. When my mother took the stand, her testimony followed the same pattern. Denial, deflection, and increasingly desperate explanations for evidence that pointed toward their guilt. Michael's cross-examination of her was brief but devastating. Mrs. Martinez, your husband testified that your mother-in-law was becoming forgetful and confused toward the end of her life. Do you agree with that assessment? She had some senior moments. Senior moments. Can you give me an example? My mother fumbled for an answer. She sometimes repeated stories. Did she ever forget to pay bills or manage her rental properties? Well, no. Did she ever seem confused about legal or financial matters when you discussed them with her? Not exactly. So her supposed confusion was limited to repeating stories occasionally? I guess so. Mrs. Martinez, does that sound like someone who was incompetent to execute a will? My mother realized she'd been trapped. I don't know. When both sides had finished presenting their cases, the judge announced she would take the matter under advisement and render a decision within 2 weeks. The courtroom emptied slowly, my parents leaving without making eye contact with me. Michael was cautiously optimistic. Their testimony was inconsistent and evasive. The evidence of document destruction is particularly damaging, but judges are unpredictable in family disputes. 2 weeks later, I returned to that same courtroom for the judge's decision. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate. My parents sat with their attorney, whispering urgently right up until the judge entered. All rise. We stood as Judge Rodriguez took her seat, her expression unreadable. She opened a folder, reviewed her notes briefly, then looked up at all of us. This court has carefully considered all testimony and evidence presented in this matter. The case involves allegations of a destroyed or suppressed will, which are serious charges requiring clear and convincing evidence. My heart hammered against my ribs. The evidence presented establishes several key facts. First, that Carmen Martinez was a competent, organized individual who was concerned about the proper disposition of her estate. Second, that she did execute some form of legal document regarding her properties, witnessed by credible individuals, including a licensed notary. Third, that this document disappeared under suspicious circumstances following her death. The judge paused, her gaze moving between my parents and me. Most troubling to this court is the respondent's testimony regarding their search of the deceased's belongings and their disposal of documents without proper review or consultation. The evidence suggests a pattern of behavior designed to conceal rather than reveal the deceased's true intentions. I held my breath. However, the court cannot simply assume the contents of a missing will, no matter how suspicious its disappearance. While the evidence strongly suggests that Carmen Martinez did execute a will favorable to the petitioner, this court cannot enforce provisions of a document that cannot be produced. My heart sank. We'd proven the will existed, but that wasn't enough. But then the judge leaned forward, and something shifted in her expression. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she reached for another document from her folder. However, she continued, her voice taking on a different tone, during the course of these proceedings, this court became aware of additional evidence that was brought to my attention just this morning. She held up a manila envelope. It seems that Carmen Martinez, in her wisdom, made arrangements that her family was unaware of. She deposited a copy of her executed will with the clerk of this court 3 weeks before her death, with instructions that it only be opened in the event of a dispute over her estate. The courtroom went dead silent, my parents' faces drained of all color. The judge's smile widened slightly. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction, "this is interesting." She opened the envelope and began reading. "The last will and testament of Carmen Martinez clearly states that all 7 rental properties are to be left to Elena Martinez, with specific instructions that they remain affordable housing for families in need." My father slumped in his chair. My mother covered her face with her hands. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "given the evidence of document destruction and the deliberate concealment of this will's existence, this court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution." Justice, it turns out, sometimes wears the quiet smile of truth finally spoken. Carmen had protected her legacy one final time, even from the grave. The cottages were safe, the families could stay, and somewhere I knew my grandmother was finally at peace.